This conference will now be recorded.
So these are the phototoxic plants in Ontario, and their symptoms initially start with a burning pain sensation within 24 to 48 hours. The sensation is more painful than it is itchy, like you have the itchiness of a poison ivy rash. After about 48 hours, the lesions are red, irregularly shaped, and there's vesiculation, or these kind of blisters can form. And it's very warm and tender to the touch. And there can be a little bit of itchiness. Over the long term, it can take months to years for this hyperpigmentation to leave. Um, so there can also be some potential ongoing sensitivity to the sun that can last months. Here's a good example because it shows on this rash that there's a bit of streaking on the arms. And so this is usually from parts of the plant coming into contact with the skin at different parts. And this is why it's often confused with poison ivy rashes, because it can look kind of similar superficially. But the difference is it's not an allergic dermatitis, so you don't need to become sensitized. Phytophotodermatitis is something that everyone can get if they are exposed to the sap, and then the sap contacts the sun. And darker skinned individuals tend to have more protection against this rash because melanin is protective against the phytotoxins, and high humidity increases absorption of these toxins. And so that's very important in terms of if you're controlling and managing these species, you want to avoid days that are high in humidity, as it can not only increase absorption, but if, for example, you're mowing a patch of wild parsnip, and those oil particles can remain suspended in the air. So this is an example that came to us a while ago, and it's a good example because it shows why it's so important to clean contaminated equipment. So I developed a burn from resting a parsnip predator handle on my arm. Someone neglected to scrape off soil on the blade, so I was scraping it off in our garage. I walked to the office and noticed irritation on my arm within 10 minutes. Luckily, I had a sink, Technique scrub, and Dawn dish soap at my disposal and washed it thoroughly. I still ended up getting a red, angry burn that got progressively worse over the next 10 days. So even just coming into contact with contaminated equipment can cause a serious reaction. Okay, one sec. Okay, so to give a bit of background, giant hogweed is an invasive perennial herb that's native to the Caucasus Mountains in Southwest Asia. In the early 19th century, it was quite fashionable in early European gardens to plant as an attractive ornamental, and it's likely how it first arrived in Ontario. The first record was in 1949, and it's likely spread through waterways. There's a wide range of negative impacts, not only to the human health risks, but pets and livestock are also susceptible. It decreases biodiversity. It's very fast growing and can easily outcompete native plants. And it also degrades riparian habitat because the roots are poor soil holders, and so when the plants die back in the fall, there's increased erosion and siltation of riverbanks. And for all these negative impacts, it's listed as a noxious weed both provincially and federally. Hogweed does really well in full sun, and it's pretty widespread throughout Ontario now. Typically, anytime you have a river stream system, you're going to find hogweed somewhere. It's found along riparian areas, wet ditches, transportation corridors along forest edges, and meadows. And then wild parsnip. So wild parsnip, in contrast to giant hogweed, It's also native to Europe and Asia, but it was planted as a root crop and it's been used for centuries. It was brought to North America by European settlers. And the cultivated variety is grown in all provinces and has also been used for research purposes, medicinal purposes. And it's likely that the invasive wild parsnip is an escaped cultivar. And not only is it a risk to field workers, but it's not a very good forage crop. It inhibits weight gain and fertility in livestock. It's found in a lot of disturbed areas, fields and meadows. It's listed as an invasive species, and it's also a noxious weed provincially and federally. Cow parsnip is the only native Heracleum species that's native to North America. It's found in similar habitats, meadows, edges of moist woods. And interestingly, a lot of North American tribes would eat cow parsnip, the leaf and the bud stalks, as a root vegetable once they carefully peeled the outer layer. It's the most similar in appearance to giant hogweed, and for this reason, it's the most frequently confused. For example, in the city of London, there are always reports to the city about potential hogweed infestations. A lot of the time it ends up being cow parsnip or another species you'll see later, Angelica. So the next part of preventing yourself from getting a really bad rash is to know your plants, to be able to identify them and know the differences between these different plants. And so I'm going to go over some of the main things, the main ID features to look out for. So in terms of height, giant hogweed is gigantic in its full glory when its flowering stalk is in the right environmental conditions. It can reach up to 5.5 meters. It can take several years to get to this stage as it's a perennial and lives for several years as a basal rosette, but it can reach this in about 5 to 10 years, and it can grow rapidly within one growing season. Wild parsnip is a much shorter plant. It only reaches about 1.5 meters. Cow parsnip, there's maybe a bit of overlap with giant hogweed, but overall it's a smaller plant, reaching a maximum height of 2.5 meters. The flowers are also different. In giant hogweed, they're very large flowers and they're full bloom. They're also, as you can see, compare with cow parsnip, they're a lot fuller. So there's more rays per umbel in this flower, and it looks a lot more umbrella shaped. It's also much larger, reaching up to 90 centimeters, almost a meter just for the flower. And cow parsnip is only 10 to 30 centimeters. So it's a much smaller flower. It's less dense. And wild parsnip, of course, is yellow, but it's also a much smaller plant at 10 to 20 centimeters diameter for the flower. The stems are a really important ID feature, especially between giant hogweed and cow parsnip. Giant hogweed has purple, blotched purple or entire purple stems. All of the plants, parsnip and hogweed, are hollow, but the stems of giant hogweed are very hairy. They're these bristly hairs, and around the node there's their hair as well, and it's quite a thick stem at 5 to 15 centimeters. Wow, when it's flowering stalk. Wild parsnip has these ridged stems. It's also hollow except at these nodes, and it's a much smaller, thinner stem, and it has very few hairs. Cow parsnip, in contrast, it's also hairy, not quite as hairy. It's a green stem. It doesn't have nearly as much of the purple spots to it, and it reaches up to 5 centimeters in thickness. And also the stems tend to be more branched in cow parsnip, whereas giant hogweed tends to have, the flowering stalk tends to be one single stem. The leaves are quite different between giant hogweed and cow parsnip. In giant hogweed, the leaves are prominently spiked. So there's these really like serrated, angry looking leaves. They have a pronounced jagged appearance, and the leaves are called tripartite because they're divided into 3 parts, and these parts are again divided into 3. They can be quite enormous. They reach up to 1.5 meters long. And the petiole, the part that attaches to the stalk, is usually very short. In contrast, cow parsnip has a much longer petiole that attaches to the stem, and the leaf is quite different. It's not that same serrated, large leaf look to it. It's palmately lobed, and so it's more like shaped like a hand with fingers than it is a large serrated leaf. Wild parsnip has distinct sawtooth edges. It's shaped like a midden, or better, it's feather-like. So it's called pinnately compound. So there's a central stalk, and then there's the leaflets are directly opposite to one another. There's 2 to 5 pairs of opposite leaflets. And for some lookalikes, Queen Anne's lace is a very common lookalike. It's really widespread throughout fields in Ontario and grows alongside wild parsnip very often. One of the key ID features is this single purple flower right in the center of the umbel and a few of the flowering stalks. The leaves are quite different. They're fern-like leaves. It's a much smaller plant. It's found in a lot more areas too, waste areas, roadsides. It doesn't have the phytotoxic properties, although there are some reports I have read in the literature of rare reactions or sensitivity even to Queen Anne's lace. And it has a carrot smell when crushed. It's an ancestor of the garden carrot. Angelica is another plant that's frequently confused with giant hogweed. It reaches a height of up to 2.1 meters. You can see it's in riparian areas, very similar habitat to giant hogweed. The flowers, if you see it in its flowering state, it's they're more globular than they are these large umbrella-like flowers. And the leaves are also very different. They're compound leaves. And although it has a purple stem, they're not hairy. And Angelica is also a nice native plant. Here's an example in the early spring of a baby giant hogweed and how it compares to a small Angelica. As you can see, they're quite different plants. Already in the early spring, these leaves are enormous. Golden Alexander is a really nice native plant that can superficially resemble wild parsnip. I think personally it looks really similar to goutweed, especially when it's not flowering. It has this very similar shape to the leaves. They're 2 to 3 times divided, and the leaves are finely toothed. And those you tend to find in richer areas like open woods and meadows as well. And it's a great pollinator species. Wild chervil is a noxious weed. It's a non-native invasive that sometimes in some areas, like around the Bruce Peninsula, it's especially common. It could be superficially confused with hogweed. The leaves are quite different. They're very subdivided. And it's always important, just so we have an idea of how much these invasive plants, giant hogweed and wild parsnip, are spreading throughout Ontario, to report them. Whether it's EdMaps Ontario is a great tool for reporting invasive plant species. You could also use iNaturalist as a great tool, and the invading species hotline. You can call them, and they'll also place it in their online mapping system distribution. So a bit of information if you're going to be controlling either hogweed or wild parsnip. Just 1 second. So it's important to of course, always wear protective clothing and eye protection, regardless of how you're going to manage. You want to reduce your exposure to the sap. It can cause The sap can cause blindness if it reaches the eye, so you especially want to have eye protection. Some interesting facts about the phytotoxins in giant hogweed. In one of the literature papers I read, the higher concentration of the foranicurmurins are in the fruit, intermediate in the leaf, and minimal in the stem. And there's also seasonal peaks of when the concentration is higher. So in June, it tends to be the highest, about intermediate in August, and minimal in November. And wild parsnip actually tends to be more potent than giant hogweed. Protective clothing to keep in mind: eye protection, of course, goggles, face shield, waterproof gloves and rubber boots, a long sleeve shirt and pants. Wearing a disposable spray suit over the clothing is also important, and taping the coveralls at the wrists and ankles to minimize contact with the skin. When you remove the protective clothing, it's important that you don't come into any contact with the sap. And in our BMP, we have this sort of in a specific order that you do it in. So wash rubber gloves with soap and water, then remove the spray suit, remove your eyewear, then the non-disposable clothing goes in the laundry, and you wash yourself with soap and water. And again, it's very important that you wash all equipment that could have potentially come into contact with the sap. If you do come into contact, wash the area immediately with soapy water. Especially dish soap is supposed to be better than just regular soap, because the way dish soap is, it removes all of the oil better than it does just regular soap. I think we have someone whose background noise I can hear. Okay. Yeah, and don't rub the skin or scrub the area, so that can make increase the amount of oil, which can increase how much gets into the skin. Removing all spray suit and protective clothing, washing gloves, avoiding any exposure to the sunlight is really important. Don't go out into the sun for at least 48 hours. Applying sunscreen in the area of burn, and covering the area with a cool, damp cloth. Any humidity and sweating or warmth will open the pores and increase the absorption of the phytotoxic chemicals. And if there are any symptoms that appear, seek medical advice within 48 hours. They usually treat it the same way they would treat a chemical burn. And if you have any direct exposure to the eye, of course, that's really serious. Immediately flush with water and seek medical attention. So in terms of control, the best time is in the early spring and in late April and early May. And this is when the basal rosettes of giant hogweed are just starting to come up. And so this tends to be the easiest time, and the time when you have less likelihood to be exposed to the toxic sap. As the growing season progresses, you have an even higher increased health and safety risk with controlling later in the year. So if there's just a small population of less than 400 plants, or you're in an environmentally significant area where you can't use herbicides, digging is the best method. The rosette phase in the spring is the best, and so the idea is to dig out the entire root. The best time is when the soil is wet and moist, and just get in there with a spade and dig out the entire root. It can be a very thick root later on in the year. When it's already flowering, we recommend three different stages: from first removing the flower head, then cutting the stalk to below eye level, and then digging the entire root out to get rid of the entire plant. When you have larger populations, greater than 400 plants, chemical is the best method. It's recommended to use a systemic herbicide like glyphosate or triclopyr, which becomes translocated through the entire actively growing plant. Foliar spray is the most effective in the spring once the leaves have fully expanded, and followed by another application later in the summer to control mist plants. And so foliar spray doesn't work once it's flowered, so it's again important to do this in the spring. It's important to follow all regulations, including the Ontario Pesticides Act and the Ontario Regulation 6309. Another time that you can spray is in the late fall when the rosettes start to grow there as well. You need numerous applications throughout the year. After you treat chemically, it's also recommended to cover the area in mulch for about 10 to 14 days to prevent any more weed growth. What's not recommended is mowing. Mowing is very labor intensive, and you would need to repeat multiple times, like every 2 weeks, for this to be effective. There's also greater health risks and potential for sap to splash onto people, into equipment, and for people to come into contact with a cut stem base. The main objective, if you would do some kind of mowing, would be to reduce seed production. It's also not practical on a very large plant. Motorized tools pose a danger to sap exposure, and so they're not really recommended. Flower removal is difficult, especially when you have a very large flowering stalk. It has to be done with a lot of care, and it's challenging if it's already gone to seed, because it's too difficult to remove the seed heads without dispersing the seeds. For wild parsnip, wild parsnip only reproduces by seed, so the goal of any control plan should be reducing seed production. So similar to giant hogweed, small populations of wild parsnip can be removed by digging the entire plant by its roots, which is again ideal in the spring. You can do mowing for large populations. Proper timing is really important. If you don't have the right timing, you can actually increase the spread of wild parsnip. So the best time is as soon as the flowering stalks appear and before it sets seeds. And then you need to repeat that usually over several times during the season. So you repeat whenever the flowers start to grow again. Dry conditions are best. Again, high humidity increases health and safety risks from the sap, little droplets being suspended in the air with any kind of mowing tools, and it increases absorption of the phytotoxins in the skin. For large populations like giant hogweed, chemical is best, again in the early spring and late fall before it starts to flower. Once it's in flower, it's no longer, a lot of these herbicides are no longer effective. Foliar spray, whereas covering the entire leaf, is effective, or wick, just individual wick applications if it's in a more sensitive area. And like giant hogweed, covering in mulch after treatment's recommended, so you reduce the amount of germination of any other weed species that come up. For disposal, it's important to not compost or burn either wild parsnip or giant hogweed. The disposal is essentially the same for both. Leave the stems at the removal site if possible, allowing them to dry out. Then place them in black plastic bags and leave them in the direct sun for at least a week so they bake, and then contact a local municipality to see if they can be sent to the local landfill or to the municipal compost, and find out what kind of procedures they use for wild parsnip and giant hogweed. Okay, so that was the phytotoxic plants, and now we're on to the urushiol-induced contact dermatitis plants, poison ivy, or the immune system plants. So Poison ivy is a different mechanism. It's an allergic response to plant oleoresins in sensitized individuals, and it's caused by direct contact of the sap from a portion of bruised or injured plants. One thing that's similar with giant hogweed and wild parsnip, you won't get the rash if you just briefly brush past a plant. You do actually have to be exposed to the sap that contains the oils, and it's the same for poison ivy. All parts of the plant at all times of the year contain urushiol, the leaves, stems, and roots. It can also be spread through indirect contact through clothing, shoes, tools, pets, and burning the plant as well. And the oils in the oleoresins often can remain in the clothing or shoes for many years. So it's important to always clean your equipment and clothes if you think you've been in contact. Both dead and live plants contain the oleoresins. And this type of reaction is called a type 4 hypersensitivity or delayed type hypersensitivity reaction because it takes several hours to a full day after exposure to develop symptoms. And because there's this delayed onset, there's a lot of time to transfer these oils from the initial site of contact to various parts of the body. And so there's different immune cells that are involved, T cells instead of antibodies, that take time to develop a memory of the antigen. And so a person needs to become sensitized. So when people say, oh, I'm immune to poison ivy, like often you need the time to develop the exposure to then become sensitized to the poison ivy urushiol. Poison ivy and poison sumac, which are both in Ontario, are in the cashew family, Anacardiaceae, and similarly, mangoes and cashews also have some in the leaves. They have some of the urushiol and can be irritating. Unlike giant hogweed and wild parsnip, it's a native plant, and it's actually a very beneficial wildlife plant to a whole bunch of animals, birds, and mammals. Humans and some higher primates are actually the only species that react to poison ivy. And it's also listed as a noxious weed under the Weed Control Act. So the symptoms start with some itchiness, and it can be really intense or burning red rash with some linear streaks where there's been contact with the plant. Within 4 hours to 4 days it takes before there's a reaction, and there's swelling, red bumps that turn into blisters, and that can ooze clear fluid. It can be a fairly mild reaction all the way till severe, where you have blisters and severe edema and real discomfort. Unlike the hogweed or parsnip rash, it's more of an itchy than it is a painful kind of rash. The most common areas for re-exposure are fingernails, clothing, tools, equipment, and pets. And unlike giant hogweed, which you see in sun-exposed areas, both covered and exposed areas are at risk of this rash. So the best thing is to know how to recognize and avoid poison ivy, to wear protective clothing, and make sure you're washing those clothing thoroughly if you've been in contact. If you're wearing gloves, vinyl is better than latex. The oils go through latex gloves. Long sleeve shirts, long pants and boots, washing all gear that have been in contact. And the biggest difference is if you come into contact with the sap, that there's less concern about the sun, and it's really important to scrub under your fingernails because that's one of the most common ways the oils are spread when someone starts itching the rash. Wash the area immediately with cool soapy water, and again, a Dawn dish detergent tends to work better than regular soap. And it is possible to prevent dermatitis entirely within 10 minutes of contact of the plant if you carefully remove the oils with a damp cloth. It's possible to not have a reaction at all. And some topical treatments are then used to soothe itching, like calamine lotion. And if there are more serious medical symptoms like fever or pus, and there's no improvement, if things were just getting worse, definitely seek medical advice. Part of poison ivy identification, it's good to know what it looks like throughout the year. So most people know the leaves of 3 in the spring. It's very glossy in appearance. This is when it's the most potent. In the summer, it can take a lot of different shapes and varieties, so it can actually get kind of confusing sometimes. They tend to always have somewhat of a glossy sheen to them. And there's also a form that spreads as a vine up trees. In the fall and winter, they have these characteristic white berries that are often eaten by birds. And in the winter, there's also this, the vines cling to trees, and so you'll see these kind of hairy attachments to the main trunk of a tree. There's a lot of lookalikes. Actually, Manitoba Maple, when it's a young seedling, looks really similar to poison ivy, and it can be easily confused. The difference is that Manitoba Maple has opposite stem arrangements on the main stem versus poison ivy is alternate. Some other lookalikes, toothwort, sarsaparilla can look really similar sometimes when you're just walking quickly through a forest. Even Virginia creeper, even though it has 5 leaves, it can look sometimes like poison ivy. And here's some other lookalikes, raspberry and fragrant sumac. Fragrant sumac does have a nice aromatic smell when it's crushed, and it's more of a shrub. Okay, so that was the end of my talk. If anyone has any questions, or even if you wanted to share an experience you might have had with one of these plants that would be interesting to learn about, would love to hear it. So fire away any questions in the chat box below. One of the questions, what is the best way to get rid of poison ivy? So poison ivy is a noxious weed, and it's only treated when it's a direct threat to human health and safety. Typically, it's treated with herbicides similar to hogweed, like glyphosate, although it's a bit beyond the scope of this talk, so I can't get into too many specifics about the actual herbicides that are used. Which level of government removes giant hogweed? From what I know, it's been mainly municipalities have been taking on the role of treating giant hogweed. Some have been like the city of London. There's a group that's gotten started along the Grand River that's working to control giant hogweed. From what I know, I think it's mainly municipal right now. Ooh, can black flies be carriers of sap? I'm sorry, I'm not sure about that. If black flies could be carriers, that's a great question. Is poison ivy active after a frost? I think it still is. The compounds are there kind of throughout the year. Oh, okay. So for the native cow parsnip, is removal not recommended? If it's an issue for safety, how do you remove it? So Yeah, usually cow parsnip is left alone because it is a native species, unless it poses a direct threat. If it's somewhere where it's going to cause a direct health hazard. If it is, then it's treated in a similar way to giant hogweed. Huh. Do you know of any community efforts to remove giant hogweed other than the Grand River Initiative? No, John, so far it's just your organization. Any BMPs for managing poison ivy? Timings, chemical concentrations. We don't have any because it's a native species, so we're mainly focused on invasive plants and their management. I could maybe direct you later if I could find any control measures for that. I haven't seen any though, specifically for poison ivy. One comment, black bags should never be used for hazardous plants. Clear only so you can see what's in the bag. Handle as toxic waste and dispose in landfill. Yeah, things. And quite often it is just a black plastic bag is used. But yeah, I agree. A clear bag is good so you see what's in there. Although the thing is the black plastic helps bake the plant before you take it to the disposal. So if you could, I don't know, maybe tarp the plant in some black plastic and over some clear plastic bags, maybe that could work. In Gatineau, there are invasions of parsnip under hydro lines. Not many plants, but probably will be in the future. In our neighborhood, what would be the best control to do? Probably mowing, just continual mowing throughout the year, and if there's some isolated satellite populations to dig out some early rosettes. Another question. Government removal, the landowner is responsible to remove giant hogweed. Yeah, that's right. As being a noxious weed, it's required. Oh, that's great to know. The city of Brampton has been very successful at eliminating giant hogweed from our valleylands, reduced by 90%, and all we have used is 2% glyphosate. That's great. Thanks for that comment. Can you add more about cases of wild parsnip in livestock? Will they eat it? Much of the concern is agricultural. Yeah, quite a bit of it is focused on agriculture. I haven't heard any specific cases. It's just, from what I've heard, it's known to impact livestock, fertility, and overall health. If anyone has experience here who's listening, I would love to hear more about that. Another comment, if you can leave cut plants on site, then you don't have to worry about disposal or contaminating another site. Giant hogweed and parsnip will break down within a week. Yes, definitely. That's the best, if you can just leave it on site. And especially, that's also why it's more to control before it's gone to seed. Then you can just leave it on site and it'll decompose. What about the root? In terms of, I'm not sure what the question is. What about the root? In terms of control or? Okay. What about the root in response to leaving cut plants? Ideally, if you're controlling, you're gonna remove the entire root too, with giant hogweed, and so you just leave everything on site, including the roots. If you do leave the roots, it's probably better to be treating with the glyphosate or systemic herbicide in the spring, letting it die. Okay, I have time for maybe one or two more questions. Yes, there's one comment about plants that are antidotes to poison ivy. Yeah, there's a couple folk remedies. I know of spotted jewelweed is one, and calendula. There's one as also, it's escaping my mind now what it is. There's another plant, I think dock or something, that's also beneficial. Yeah, anything, I mean, if you have a rash, it's going to be very itchy, and there are a lot of different remedies you can use to relieve the itching if it happens. An oatmeal bath is also very effective. Can you cut giant hogweed down and then paint stump with glyphosate? That might be a bit difficult because of the hollow stems. Usually, if something like that, it's a stem injection that would be recommended more. Another comment regarding livestock. Oh, thanks. University of Guelph had published that cows grazing on giant hogweed had reduced milk production. Wild parsnip may have been in that report. Check with Mike Cohen or Megan. Thanks for that. That's great. Oh, that's a great question. Should stinging nettle also be considered hazardous? Yeah, it was one of the plants I was thinking about mentioning in here. We get asked about stinging nettle quite often. It's not a native plant. There's the European one, and there's also a native nettle, wood nettle. They're considered, like, even though they're not native, they're not invasive, and they're not a giant threat to human health, and they even have some useful medicinal properties. Stinging nettle is also a host for the red admiral butterfly caterpillars. And so overall, it is a beneficial plant. From what I know, it's only treated in a similar way to poison ivy if it's in a spot where there's going to be any kind of direct risk. So it's sort of in that gray area, and stinging nettle isn't as serious of a reaction because it's something that can just go away in a few hours unless you've really like jumped into a patch. Here's a comment: do not paint giant hogweed, it will not uptake. Stem injection of 5 milliliters of glyphosate will work, but is not on the label in Ontario. Okay, thanks for that comment. All right. Great. Okay. Well, I think that's wraps it up. And so I think that pretty much wraps it up. So thank you so much for listening, and stay tuned to some of our future webinars. If you have any questions or comments after the webinar, please feel free to email us, and thank you very much.